the 3 Shots of Espresso. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the 3 Shots of Espresso podcast. Tonight, we will be looking at the topic of Muslim heritage in Mzansi, Muslim heritage in South Africa. I would just like to welcome back the brothers, Sheikh Zakaria and Mohammed Ismail. I think congratulations are in order. So congratulations to you and yours, Mohammed Ismail. And we look forward to this very interesting discussion about Muslim heritage in South Africa and what does it mean for us in the here, in the now, as Muslims living in the 21st century within this country. And naturally our observations, because we do live in a global village, may apply to other parts of the world as well. And we do take lessons from Muslims in other parts of the world too. What comes to mind when we look at when we think about our heritage here in South Africa as Muslims?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sayyidi Anwar. Yes, I think when we think about South Africa, we really think about, actually, maybe let me start with an anecdote. I go back to my time in primary school at one of the Muslim schools in Lenasia, and I recall very vividly our time in primary school. We had to do a project about Muslims in South Africa, and I think in the late 90s, or let's say mid 90s, in fact, we were celebrating 300 years of Islam in South Africa. And I recall at the time sort of trying to gather my thoughts around the length of time that Muslims have been present in South Africa. And I think when we think about heritage and we think about our role in that heritage, it sort of goes back to that period, that early period when the first Muslims arrived here. And if we look at that timeline, it would be 300 plus minus 320 years. And I think so for me, it always goes back to that. And then I recall again very vividly all the research that we had done at the time in primary school, albeit not very deep research, would have been around the first Muslims to have come here as political exiles, the first Muslim community that started at the Cape, and then from there onwards, the first masjids or the first mosques, and then the first communities that sort of sprouted and the challenges they faced. And then we talk about we talk about the pioneers of Islam in South Africa and some of the key figures. And then from there onwards, of course, the timeline just continues. So that's sort of my time frame that when I think about Muslim heritage in South Africa.
I like what you're mentioning about, like, let's say, for example, we know that always the story of Islam in South Africa really starts with the coming of, I would say freedom fighters that were brought as prisoners of war, or, were made into slaves and brought to the Cape. Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, for example, rahimullah. I mean, not only did he come from a royal family, but he himself was an alim, and he was teaching the deen, and he continued to do that even when he came to the Cape as a political prisoner. Though he was, welcomed by the Dutch, apparently they did, afford him certain types, let's say a bit of a cordial treatment. If you read some of the historical records, and I say this standing for correction, but at the end of the day, he was a political prisoner. He was involved in basically the resistance against Dutch colonialism in his own homeland, So this was a Muslim freedom fighter. We know that story. It's one that's ingrained into the Muslim psyche in South Africa, especially in the Cape. But I think that, when we think of South Africa, we always talk about, South Africa being a rainbow nation. And because we're this rainbow nation, we're made up of so many different, cultures. And all of these cultures, they have, a unique heritage. And all of them have a role to play in shaping South Africa into this unique rainbow nation that it is. So we all have a role to play. so there was Sheikh Yusuf, and later on you had people like Tuan Guru, and all of them, that contributed to, let's say this Muslim cultural expression. But then also, what about the arrival of Muslims from the Indian subcontinent in the 1800s, initially coming as indentured laborers, under basically the British Crown, but no doubt leaving a very, very strong cultural imprint, for Islam in South Africa, one that is definitely felt almost throughout the entire world because of the Muslim community in South Africa.
No, sure. I mean, again, we hate to just bring it down to the two sort of what is now minority groups in South Africa in terms of ethnicity, the Cape Malays, as they are called, or as it were, and then of course Indian Muslims. And though this is the starting point, at least as far as the research that we have read, and of course both of us, and I'm sure others would stand to be corrected, but there may be historical evidence that Muslims had, perhaps, maybe, I know one of my friends was telling me that there could have been a migration of Muslims from North Africa that came down at some point too. So, I guess maybe we can say what is recorded in terms of what we know, this is where it starts. But it doesn't mean that this takes away from anything, that has developed since. When we look at Islam and Muslim heritage in South Africa, we can celebrate it within the multicultural background that we also celebrate, and it then is shared by everyone. And this goes also back to the fact that Islam and Muslims was never focused. I mean, it goes back to the what is now referred to as the final sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said, "No Arab has any virtue over a non-Arab." And so it's not about what was necessarily their race of those who came, but it's what they brought with them, which contributes to the heritage of South Africa. And I think if we can focus, or if we, in our discussion, we focus on that, then we will have sort of more of an all-encompassing meaning and a more encompassing and meaningful discussion.
No, absolutely. I have to agree with you. There's each cultural group, throughout the entire world has, certain unique features about it. And one, yes, that contributes to this very diverse fabric, or the quilt of humanity, and that makes the basically human society what it is. Diversity can be a very, very beautiful thing. And there isn't some, this idea of, like, let's say, some kind of an Aryan race. And Islam is not attempting to Arabize people, and that's definitely not the case of Islam in South Africa. Nobody is attempting to Arabize, the landscape. Nobody is attempting to Indianize or to Indianize South Africa, or South African expression of Islam, and the contributions that Muslims make on a daily basis in so many different fields and in so many different ways to the country. Each culture has something to contribute, and Islam is, like, as Dr. Umar Faruq Abd-Allah says in his fantastic paper called Islam, the Cultural Imperative, which we hope to share, inshallah. He says that Islam is like, a clear, beautiful, sweet river, right, with pure water. But all it does is that it just reflects the different colors of the bedrock of the river underneath, at the bed of the river. And as the river flows across the land, at different points you're going to see, different colors reflected in the water, simply because the bedrock changes. And what are those changes? What are those colors that's reflecting? It's the culture of the people. So you have the timeless values and beliefs of Islam, and then you have, I would say, the intrinsic human beauty of the different human cultures that we all come from.
Yeah, no, indeed. And that's where, as the river bends, so does its complexion. And as it flows, so does it pick up speed and sometimes slow down. And I think just extending that the contribution of Muslims in South Africa has likewise been the same. There was times when we really were major contributors to what a civilization that was developing in the Cape at the time, and very much in the language. It is in fact, it's said that the first to develop what is referred to as Afrikaans was in fact that early Muslim community, and not necessarily the Dutch who came with their own language at the time. But Cape Town, in its development as a sort of a civilization almost at that time, because it was so restricted, and in fact perhaps maybe even today that's why we call it its own country by itself, and some say that tongue-in-cheek, trying to poke holes at others or to poke at other points. But definitely, I mean, in that one sense, it was very vibrant, and in fact, it developed its own language. And then at other times, the river began to slow down, and others took, the ascendancy. And I guess that's just sort of a metaphor that you mentioned it, and maybe just extend it, maybe not as eloquent as Dr. Umar Faruq Abdullah and as how you've laid it out, but I do think something that resonates in terms of our development in this country.
No, absolutely. And like on that point about, like, let's say the language, let's not forget people like Tuan Guru and Sheikh Yusuf and others actually to lay the foundations of Islam in South Africa. They were people who could write out the Quran from memory and ahadith and so forth from memory, and they passed it down to the generations. And because Arabic is the lingua franca of basically the Muslim world, especially as an academic language, because we want to understand the Quran in its original Arabic. We want to understand the prophetic traditions, the sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in his original Arabic. So we've been studying the language, in so many different parts of the world. And Arabic, I mean, some of the best Arabists that were ever produced, many of them were actually non-Arabs. Sibawayh is a prime example. Arguably one of the first grammars that were written in the Arabic language was written by a non-Arab, who was a master of the language. But talking about writing, when we spoke about Afrikaans, let's not forget that the first written document in Afrikaans, the language, was actually written in the Arabic script with Arabic letters. And that's part and parcel of the history of Islam in South Africa.
Of course, yes. And I mean, it's been very well documented. And again, it's not something that we say, people deny, but it's something that is easily forgotten when you start to talk about things like minority groups, and when you refer to as a minority group. And here, sometimes even those that are of Black African origin, as soon as they are called Muslims, they then become referred to also as a minority group, and not because of their skin color, but because of their consciousness. And I think that's also another point that we can pick up in the discussion, is that how does this heritage unfold over the centuries of Islam in South Africa? How has it been maintained? And how is it even being used sometimes to marginalize? And other times, it's been celebrated. So from our perspective on this particular point, when it comes to the Arabic language being used as the script for Afrikaans in the early stages, and Afrikaans itself from inception, is definitely something that we celebrate, and definitely one that we are happy to say has contributed enormously to the heritage, or the cultural sort of heritage of South Africa and South Africans.
No, I'm with you. I know I want to touch on this point about the marginal. Let's talk about the idea of adopting cultures. I've had this experience, loving working in obviously the Muslim community in different ways, and I've had friends that once they embraced Islam, I mean, they were told in their own communities, "Oh, you're becoming Indian," because Islam was looked at as an Indian religion, right? So when you adopt the Deen, then basically you're adopting a foreign culture, and I think that speaks to, like, let's say, more work that we need to do. Is that just as when you're in the Middle East, you feel Islam through a lot of the Arab culture that surrounds you. When you, for example, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in India, the Indian subcontinent, you can experience basically the deen through the culture of the people as well, right? So what about Africa? Because when we travel into Central Africa, North and West and East Africa, you do see Islam reflected in the local cultures of the people. Many of them are Muslim, right? So what about South Africa? Why should South Africa be left out of that conversation? A very, very important conversation, keeping in mind that culture in South Africa is a very, very important thing. Sometimes the word culture is actually a substitute for the word religion, you know. So there's a combination of religious beliefs and cultures. So what happens when people from, let's say, the different Black African communities in South Africa adopt Islam? How does a person remain authentically a Muslim and authentically a Zulu or Sutu or from Tswana or Pedi? How do they authentically do that? And what about immigrant communities as well? You know?
Yeah, I just want to touch on that one there, because here's an interesting scenario. Perhaps maybe also it has played itself out in reality. I'm not too sure. But you know, when people are asked to, like particularly in this month, when we asked on Heritage Day to wear our local cultural dress, and this too also sometimes can be very divisive. And I've seen it particularly in the workplace, where, or at least not even in the workplace, even in other instances where others, refer to some parts of our communities who so seemingly to them have no culture because they come dressed with a spotty and all stars. I know this touches on a sensitive point, but I just wanted to mention that and how that can even become divisive, and how that is sort of marginalizing people. And so what if someone's culture does leave them with a spotty and all stars? There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because it's an expression. It's an expression of being. It's an expression of how our community had, how we contribute to fashion, how we contribute to the culture that comes with that fashion. Nevertheless, the point I wanted to get to is, here's a Black Muslim in South Africa, and on Heritage Day, they are told to wear their cultural dress. Now, a Zulu Muslim in South Africa, what would we want them to wear? We would actually want them to wear their Zulu dress, their traditional regalia, and not necessarily come with a kurta and a topi on to their cultural event. And the reason why I bring this up as an example is because this is the idea of understanding religion, culture, and heritage. All, if it is mixed, it can complement each other, and it's not there to divide you. It's part of your being. And I think just the point around saying, how does culture and religion define a person? In fact, in this instance here, I'd go to that extent and say, yes, that person shouldn't come with a kurta and a topi on, because that's not their cultural dress. Of course, from an Islamic perspective, we would say, as long as, and I just want to add this as a rider, even though it's not our place to even get into these discussions, but for example, some may say, yeah, but then are you advocating for certain communities in South Africa whose traditional dress includes exposing their aura? We would say no, as far as that culture is complementary to what Islam determines as the minimum in terms of what you must cover, then you should, if for example, if it's expressed in the colors of the beading of your headgear, or the use of lion skin, to show the bravery and honor and chivalry of men, and for women perhaps it's maybe in the colors that they adopt, etc. Then yes, I would say that would be something that we would encourage, because that's the heritage that you come. We cannot deny that heritage, And I don't know, maybe if you have some examples that you can think of from the Seerah, particularly just to bolster that argument, but perhaps maybe not. We don't even need to go to that extent. But I thought it just came up when you talked about culture.
Well, I think for example, let's say the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, peace be upon him, didn't stop being an Arab the day revelation came to him. He honored a lot of the cultural norms of his society, so long as they didn't violate the revelation that he was receiving, right? Also, when, for example, his companions from Abyssinia, back then known as from Abyssinia, Habasha, right, were basically engaging in a spear dance or spear play in the courtyard of the mosque, basically during the days of Eid. he didn't interrupt them. He actually brought his wife, Lady Aisha radiallahu anha, peace be upon her, to actually watch what they were doing, and what they were performing basically was essentially a spear play, or rather a dance, cultural tribal dances, from their own culture, from their own background. And I think that's a very powerful thing. Also,
exactly.
when we talk about culture, it's very easy to always talk about it in the form of dress, right? Yes, that's one thing. Food is another thing, right? But what also about, like, let's say, cultural mannerisms, social etiquette? What about, for example, the women of Mecca were perhaps maybe a little bit more, were not as outspoken as the women of Medina, right? Umar radiallahu anhu, the second Khalif of Islam, he had to experience, he experienced this firsthand, where, he noticed, Meccan women behaved with their husbands in a certain way, and the women of Medina, they behaved in a very, very different way. What today, that does have a significance, also the contemporary youth culture. While we can't, coming back to, I just want to take a slight step back. While people who are from not a certain cultural background, a certain cultural group, like I am not Zulu, I can't make decisions basically for the Zulu Muslim community. It's not my place. I'm confident in the scholarship among Zulu Muslims that they will be able to come up with the correct solutions to their own cultural expression in Islam, right? For me, as an outsider and as a student of the Deen, it's something very beautiful to watch, people basically interpreting the culture through the lens of Islam. It's a very interesting thing to do, but at the end of the day, I can't be the one saying do this and don't do that, because I don't understand the nuances of those questions. And I learned that as a first-hand experience with students of mine who had reverted to Islam, and there I found myself teaching them, fiqh, and a lot of the questions that they had, it was really, a very interesting experience where I was really learning from them, because a lot of their questions had to do with their culture, their cultural backgrounds. And there I'm sitting on the one hand teaching fiqh, but also I'm getting an anthropological education here, because these are like, not the very typical fiqh questions, because a lot of them were grounded in their cultural heritage. And I was not equipped to answer those questions. So it became a very, very interesting learning experience. I'm very, very grateful to that group of students for that experience. But let's talk about contemporary culture. How should we engage the contemporary culture of the world, the contemporary culture that plays out in our communities? Because a lot of young people, unfortunately, when they find in their face, let's say their place within the house of Islam, being proud members of the Muslim Ummah, unfortunately, a lot of them feel like they have to stop being young. They need to become old, boring, uninteresting, right? And stop having fun. But no, culture is something that constantly changes. So where is the space for youth culture?
Look, I think just to build towards my view on that point is that when I look at heritage, what comes with that is then a discussion on race, creed, and then sort of the practices, the common practices of a particular ethnic group and or community, which then become entrenched. And then all of these things merge into something which, for example, in our instance, and I'll take it as Indian Muslims, which we refer to as Indian Muslim culture. And Indian Muslim culture will be, for example, eating samosas during Ramadan and calling dates kajur, and having for example, at a funeral, doing specific practices, or having puri and pateria with kheer. That's in our food. In the way we speak, we say wuzu, and in the way we practice our religion, we may have certain things that are peculiar to an Indian Muslim community. So that then also brings the slit kurta into place, and people call it a kurta. Someone asked a question to one of the muftis, and I read it, and it said, did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wear a kurta? And the
So,
response was by Mufti Saleji in that instance that the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not wear a slit kurta. So I said to another person that in fact it wasn't even called a kurta. The question and the answer both had the word kurta in, and that's part of Indian heritage, Indian culture in expression through language. Absolutely nothing wrong with it, and I'm not
beautiful
I'm
in
not
its own right.
denying that. Exactly, it's in there in the culture. So I'm just saying that's sort of how culture develops, and eventually it then becomes something you leave behind, and then someone later generations, they are said to hold on to the heritage of their forefathers, which was the cultural practices of their forefathers. Just to go back into that. Then to get to your question, and I needed to do that in my mind just to get to this question, because what it helps me then do is actually open the door for me personally, open the door to the youth to charter their own version of culture and practice that they want to sort of now develop within a new South Africa, within the South Africa of 25 plus years of democracy, where things are very much more open. Social expression is no longer curtailed. People can interact across borders. You can love wherever you want. You can marry whoever you want to. You can study whatever you want to. You can express your views in whichever way you want to. And I think the youth need to embrace that. They need to embrace that with a mindset of innovation, a mindset of inclusion, and they need to, like, for example, merging some of our practices that we took from our forefathers that became our heritage and our culture, or that is our heritage and our culture, and saying, how do we complement that with other ways of doing things? So, for example, for me, youth find their expression in the way music is sung. And I've seen a lot of our Black African Muslim brothers in South Africa, they've adopted that culture, that they have adopted their heritage of music, and they've sort of adapted it to the dhikr that they make, and
Yes,
that then
absolutely.
becomes part of how they now express Islam and how they express their love for Allah and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I'm saying, not that I have the answer, and I don't think you're asking me if I have the answer. I'm just saying that the youth can apply their minds and try to innovate. Of course, keeping the parameters in place, like we always say. And we always say this because we're always afraid of people misinterpreting what we're trying to say here. Anyone who says anything about innovation or reevaluation, then it's almost as if we're taking our daggers and wanting to tear apart what has come to us from our previous generations.
Basically, you're saying that like we want to change, as if we want to change Islam, right?
Exactly.
Which we don't want to do, right?
La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. May God protect us from such a thing. But definitely, if youth, just to your point, is where youth feel constricted, they feel like there's no way to express their youthfulness. There's no way for even a Xhosa speaking Black African Muslim wanting to express the dhikr of Allah in their own language. It's then frowned upon because no, we only heard it either in Urdu, in Arabic, or in English. No, we shouldn't. We should allow the Muslim youth of our time to embrace their cultural norms and bring that into something that they're hopefully going to charter out and become something vibrant that they can then sustain themselves. Because it goes back to, and I want to just, I know I'm getting to, but the Ratibul Haddad or the Haddad, it is said, and I heard this from some of the scholars, that the way that, maybe it's incorrect, I'm not too sure, but the way the Adhkar was made and the way the slaves needed to practice upon it was very much attuned to the Neer de Lansalikis, and how it was sung by the Europeans of the time. And therefore you have that its own tune had come about. And I may well be wrong, and I do ask for your forgiveness, but I understood that they used to practice this in the fields, and that then sort of morphed into something that became a cultural practice. Today, when you ask, how do the Malays recite the Ratibul Haddad or the Haddad, they have a particular tune, right, that resonated with its youth and its older alike, that was soothing to the mind, soothing to the heart, and still allow them to express their love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's become peculiar to them. And wherever you go in the world, there may be close variations to it, but I personally have not heard anything close to it. And that very much was entrenched in how it developed in that time and who carried it. It would have been the youth, it would have been the elders, and subsequent generations then become, followers of that.
No, absolutely. I mean, there you see basically something that was a functional practice, because people, while they were in slavery, there was a banning of Islam. Let's not forget, at one point in the history of this country, Islam was a banned religion. And those Muslims, how they responded, to the banning of Islam is that they had to disguise their ibadah, and essentially they created basically songs out of adhkar, with its own unique tune, lagu, right?
Yes.
And right, which continue to today. And I mean, I had the opportunity of living in Cape Town. It was a very beautiful experience. I have family there, and when as you move around the Cape, and and you experience the local environment, it's also something quite beautiful. But that beauty is also found in other parts of the South African landscape, in the South African Muslim community as well. But when I look at young people, from so many different cultural backgrounds, whether it be the Muslims in the Cape, who themselves are diverse, right? Or people in basically in KwaZulu-Natal, or even the interior provinces of the country, sometimes you find, and I feel this here, is that we're not necessarily as a community taking stock of ourselves to say, understand that our cultures are changing, year by year. There's, people's practices change, because as the river is flowing as it's flowing along its course, things do change. And we need to be responsive to those changes. So constantly, and this is the part where, sociology and anthropology is actually very, very important for Muslim thinkers, intellectuals, and scholars within our community to constantly be watching what is happening in our society, what is good, what is bad, what needs to be kept, what needs to be altered. So basically, we're very, very responsive to the times, because we don't want a situation where young people are not finding a place within Islam. So, part of culture, yes, is the dress code. Part of culture is food, whether it be, a biryani and akni that we love, or it's, pap in Morocco, which should also be part of, let's say, the Islamic or the Muslim cultural diet in South Africa, right? Or bubar on the 15th of Ramadan. Is in the Cape as you have it. Akl-wise is definitely part of, let's say, the Muslim cultural landscape in South Africa. Right?
In Gauteng,
so
perhaps,
is the Gatsby in Gauteng, yeah, right?
Yeah.
And so is the Gatsby, right? And so is Mandra's Mandra's kitchen in Durban. But here's the thing. What about basically cultural attitudes that shape society? For example, societies that are becoming much more outspoken, like we spoke about, in South Africa right now, alhamdulillah, we have political freedom, right? And certain things that were a taboo back in the day in our communities, like women working and being educated, right? It's a fact, right? Those things, while those are things that have changed. So how are we responsive to those kind of changes? Because do we always have to have these very constrained and difficult conversations where we find ourselves, where people are not finding a place within Islam? We're not talking about changing Islam, but rather using the full breadth of Islam, to change the world in which we live in for the better. And I find that, unfortunately, sometimes we too culturally conservative, not religiously conservative. No. When there is expansion allowed, we don't want to fully explore that, because we want to hold on to narrow cultural conceptions of Islam. And I find that problematic.
Yeah, and I think the opposite, not the opposite, but sort of another extreme on the other hand of that, is those that are adopting the current cultures. And something came to mind as you were speaking, and I sort of wanted to bring this in, which is the other extreme, is that as much as we are narrow and trying to maintain our our guardrails and not allowing ourselves to grow and to organically also become something else potentially, and to let that river sometimes expand and flow with its full current, let it carry on and create vegetation on the sides and then come back in when it needs to. On the other hand, we're very, what shall I say? We're very negative towards emerging cultures. So when you look at what's an emerging culture, over the last while, there's been an emerging culture of social media, right? Over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, the emerging culture that will develop and has been developed, and that subsequent generations after us will look back on, will be the culture of how we, the early adopters of social media and all these tools and the internet in almost its full swing, how we utilize it and what we develop, and that they will pick up in the future. For example, Muslims are narrow when it comes to accepting that we should be growing organically. And on the other hand, there are certain things that are very dominant in the current culture that is potentially very negative that we adopt wholeheartedly. And I don't know if this makes sense or not, but I'll give you one example is that, and it's a buzzword because we talk about it in the media, the culture, the cancel culture. Cancel culture is something that originated in Hollywood. It originated in America, it originated on that circuit. And then you find Muslims today that on social media have adopted that culture and are canceling each other left, right, and center, for views that are generally accepted within the breadth of Islam. We take a narrow approach and then you cancel. Then those are the same people that say, no, we need to be conservative. We need to not adopt everything, but you're adopting one of the most predominant cultural norms of our time, which is the cancel culture. Yeah.
Look, I mean, cancel culture, I mean, also it emerged within activist circles, right? When activists themselves, because I always say this here, the left is not, the liberal left is not as liberal as we like to think, right? Fired all three of them, right? And I'm with you on that. So, I mean, Islam has this, there is so much diversity of opinion on so many different issues, but simply because we have become a community that has lost basically a cultural value of communication, a cultural, basically a very powerful religious tool of shura, of sitting down and engaging with each other. We substituted it basically for cancel culture that we find basically on our social media. So even our religious discourse, and I can say this here because I mean this is our podcast, right? No one's going to cancel us, right? Unless we decide to. We've adopted that in our religious discourse, so we just basically cancel out views that we don't like, even if they are true according to the deen of Islam, and maybe not according to our whims and fancies. And we cancel out the entire contributions of scholarship on an array of different issues, simply because it doesn't align with what we want or our narrow cultural conceptions of Islam. So we do that. And sometimes there is some, unfortunately, and this applies to so many different Muslim communities, but also sometimes there's this a kind of like cultural prejudice or cultural racism against other brands of scholarship simply because it didn't come from your own culture.
Yeah, exactly. Real, exactly.
Yeah.
And we see this a lot. We see this a lot where a lot of even our own community believe, and again, we'll call it out as we see it, without trying to paint everyone with the same brush. But we are in those circles, and we see it predominantly amongst the circles that we are in, where Islam is projected as a very encompassing religion, but at the same time, the norms that are upheld by some of the clergy would be that of an Indian brand of Islam or an Indian cultural way of practicing Islam. Let's rather say it that way, lest someone say there is no such thing, and there is no such thing as an Indian Islam, but an Indian cultural way of practicing Islam.
Expression,
where only those, only those scholars are referenced. A lot of people, I mean, I recall once sitting in a gathering, and I remember this vividly too, because we were in the gathering, and the lecturer was actually someone from Kuwait. He's this philanthropist who's been in South Africa for a long time, and he asked the question, how long have Muslims been in South Africa? And one of our Indian brothers said 100 years. And his reference point was only based on what he knows about what he's been told about the civilization of India, known as Indians in South Africa, and he only knows that, you know, and for all intents and purposes, I'm sure he was ignorant to the reality, and everyone's pardoned for their ignorance until they come to know, and then if you do know and you still continue to be ignorant, then you are blameworthy, right? So up until that point, he did not know. I was about to say he never knew. He did not know that Muslims had actually predated, you know, Islam in South Africa had predated the arrival of Indians in South Africa. I think this just goes back to understanding our roots, understanding our heritage. And whilst I'm saying that, and whilst I know we only have 5 minutes left, I don't want to lose the opportunity to say this, is that I would like to see, and I am seeing it, and I'm very proud as a Muslim in this country to see how West Africa and its cultural norms of practicing Islam has come down and is now taking root in South Africa. To see Senegalese taking, you know, where's the CCs from? I keep forgetting. Is it Senegal? You know,
I think it is Senegal, yeah.
Niassi and CC, is it Senegal? And you see
Senegal.
them now coming with their scholars, when you can see and look with pride that here are Black African awliyaullah, you know, walis of Allah, friends of Allah, that people are taking their religion from and that they are turning to and giving their pledges of allegiance, that they follow them, who follows them, who followed the Sahaba and who followed Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we think about the paradigm of Muslims in South Africa, we hopefully want the future generations to change it to a multicultural one and multi-ethnic grouping one, right? So when you have these Muslims from West Africa, North Africa, East Africa coming down and now starting to practice it. And then Muslims in South Africa, Black African, indigenous to this country, starting to also develop their flavor by now finding their voice and their own culture, and then merging all of that. Unfortunately, it's going to be a merging because unfortunately, I haven't seen it yet in my own practice where we've seen a Zulu community or a Pedi community or a Setswana community, you know, practicing Islam sort of from a grassroots level with its own cultural norms that eventually will become their heritage. I haven't seen it. I stand to be corrected. But what I am seeing is a merging of it and a lot of anchoring it into what they then see in other Black Africans. And they rather take in that. And I like that. I like that because it now starts to give them pride. So when you see a Nigerian coming with his kurta, let's call it using that term, but the baggy, I don't even know what they call it, you know, the nice baggy one and the
bobo.
The point, is it called?
It's called the bobo.
The bobo.
You know, the very the bobo, the very baggy type of like a thobe, right?
And that's beautiful.
Yeah,
it's beautiful, you know, and that it's going to add to our culture. I'll leave the last points for you to make, and maybe if I need to, I'll mention one or two. But I just wanted to get that in because I think that is now starting to deliver to what is eventually going to become to deliver and further develop the Muslim heritage in South Africa.
I'm with you 100%. And saying that doesn't mean, for example, that we're against any cultural groups, right? I mean, I'm proud of my Indian heritage. But I also know, and I've actually taken the time to actually look at this in my community, the Indian community of South Africa is different compared to the Indian community in India, right? The South African Indian community is Indian only via ethnicity, right? Not nationality. Its attitudes are very South African, right? Its education is very South African. Its tastes are very South African. The South African Indian diet has really changed, you know, considerably, in the almost 200 years that it's been in South Africa. There's also been like, let's say, for example, a kind of cultural revolution in the community without even anyone necessarily, let's say, acknowledging it, but it's been a grassroots level thing because people lived in little, let's say, micro ethnicities in India, but when it came to South Africa, after a little while, they started to intermarry, right? So that itself is you know, a part of the cultural melting pot. But I think also what Islam can offer different Muslim communities in South Africa and to South Africa by and large is that when culture sometimes becomes negative, that it creates unnecessary divisions and prejudice, forms of prejudice between human beings, then Islam becomes that beautiful river that it is, and basically brings us all together into the ocean that is the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Islam supersedes culture, right? So even, for example, sometimes the ethnic rifts that exist within South Africa, let's say Black South African groupings, Islam can help to overcome that simply because of basically the unifying force that the deen brings with it, right? And I like what you say, that we will see a melting pot of ideas and culture, different cultural groupings coming together, simply because we're also living in an age of globalization. There is an idea of what monoculture, right? Yes, it has its pros, it has its cons, but it's part and parcel of the world in which we're living in, and we have to engage it. So on the one hand, yes, cultural preservation is important, but also, let's say, going with the river, taking what's good of the course of the river, enjoying that, and being careful of, like, of the rapids, being careful of the rocks that we may find along the way that might capsize our boat. That's how I feel. And I do feel, I think that particularly for brothers and sisters that are very active in promoting, teaching, and studying Islam within the community, we need to be much more culturally sensitive, much more culturally aware, and understand change. So yes, you can be proud of your heritage, but at the end of the day, your heritage must not be a hindrance to further progression of the deen itself. Thank you so much.
Jazakallah khair.
Awesome. So we hope to see you next week, inshallah.
Yes, Sidi Anwar, we'll leave it at that. Jazakallah khair. Shukran to all our listeners. Those that are listening on Facebook Live and those that will be listening on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe. And we look forward to having you with us next week, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Sidi Anwar. It's been excellent. And I'm sure, we can look forward to next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.